take a shot at it. If I may just say one advertisement for myself, I'm not usually, this isn't my usual disposition, but my colleague Ling Wei in Beijing and I are writing a book about the China trade fight. So a year from now, you can all. So, you know, Trump has said several times that in Lighthouse or two, that's sort of a 4-week, as you say, a 4-week window. And I think it's pretty clear that their goal is that when Liu He comes here on May 8th to get a preliminary deal, frankly, no idea whether they'll be able to pull it off. I mean, on that kind of schedule, they'd have a signing around Memorial Day, which is a little hard to figure out how they would do it, given that Trump will be in Japan at that particular moment. But anyway, I mean, that's their goal. But, you know, as we've seen in a lot of trade negotiations, not just with this administration, but any, you know, things slip. And I think my guess would be, so there's a G20 meeting at the end of June in Japan. I would think that that is a more likely time where there would be a signing agreement. They'd have some preliminary deal before that. I mean, in my view, as to the issues outstanding, I think all of us have sort of named them. I mean, I think it's the tariffs, the enforcement, some of the digital issues like cloud computing. You know, there's a whole range of things. I mean, Lighthizer, to our consternation, keeps things very close to the vest. And so it's a little hard to tell precisely what's holding it up. But I think it's more at that political level. He's not going there next week with a big trade delegation. I think it's just him and Mnuchin and some aides, which would indicate that it's kind of the last sort of deals, which would be, again, enforcement, rollback of tariffs, and a couple other particulars.
Yeah, I would agree with Bob. I mean, I think that, you know, the greatest uncertainty is probably when they sign the agreement rather than if. We do see, you know, in trade negotiations and in this administration, the setting up of these deadlines and then deadlines repeatedly being pushed off, which I think is kind of agonizing for trade reporters, but I'm not sure it matters so much to anyone else whether or not this deal is signed in May or June, right? But I do think there is a strong motivation on both sides at this point to sign a deal. President Trump pretty clearly sees, you know, both GDP and the stock market as a kind of scoreboard for his presidency, and he has seen over the past 6 months, you know, what threats of there being no deal will do to both of those kind of economic indicators. So I do think for the administration there's motivation. There's clearly motivation from the Chinese side as well to resolve these tensions and continue to have a mutually beneficial economic relationship. And even from Robert Lighthizer, who has been very tough on China, you know, really clearly sees his mission here as getting you know, the Chinese to actually make some concessions on some of the structural issues, as well as just committing to purchases. I think at the end of the day, he would have motivation to close this deal as well, and, you know, not to have all of his work fall apart here. So, I mean, the bigger issues, you know, I also agree with my colleagues here that, you know, it's really when the tariffs will come off. The main uncertainty there being that President Trump will give the last word on, you know, which and when the tariffs how many of the tariffs will come off and when, and obviously can be kind of unpredictable. And then also the difficulty of settling on this enforcement mechanism where the United States feels like it has the right to, you know, keep its 301 authority and, you know, continue to hold the threat of tariffs over China, but China also feels like it is not agreeing to something that infringes on its sovereignty, and just kind of finding the common ground there.
I think you also have to look at this in the prism of 2020. I think that's driving a lot of the administration's positioning on this issue. At least now, I mean, Lighthizer, I think, is very clearly ideologically committed to changing China's behavior, or even decoupling, you know, some people say the U.S. economy from China's. But but I think China looks at this, I mean, I think Trump looks at this from a very political viewpoint. And if he can get China to start buying massive amounts of soybeans and pork and other things, and the question of whether we have the capacity to produce even that much more is still out there. But I think farmers have been hit pretty hard by the tariffs, not just from China, but from retaliation to steel tariffs from Canada and Mexico. There's been the flooding. Incomes of farmers are down. So I think he's looking to have China front load some of those purchases, if or when a deal is reached. And China may welcome that. I mean, they have a huge swine fever epidemic that's killing their herd of pork. So I mean, they're probably going to be looking for new supply and things like that. So I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to how fast can China ramp up these purchases. But I mean, that gets to the point where you had a good situation with China, and then are you going to be able to return to the status quo, or is the market share kind of permanently depleted? So I mean, I think there's a lot of hope that I think this administration has, that they can maybe get China to replace what they were not buying for a long time.
And one thing that we really don't have a good grip on is what the real extent of the Chinese concessions are on this core structural issues that Adam talked about at the beginning, i.e. on tech transfer and IP and cloud and all the rest. I mean, from the administration officials are saying that there's been a lot of progress made each time there's a round of negotiation. They're saying there's been more headway made, but actually there's very little concrete evidence of where the Chinese have actually moved the needle very much on these issues. So that's I think a big question mark that's still hanging over the negotiations, and it does make me wonder whether in the final stretch there's a chance that Bob Lighthizer could come back and say, look, we just haven't been able to make them budge enough, and this doesn't satisfy all the concerns raised in the 301 investigation. And he could make sort of a recommendation to Trump, not to take the deal, which, Trump might say, get lost, we're going to do the deal anyway. But I think that is one thing that I think everyone needs to watch out for, because it also means that if a deal is struck that's fairly limited on these key issues, then there could be a more serious backlash from Congress, and that could cause problems, on a political level for Trump. At the moment, it seems like Trump is in a real sweet spot, because he's got the markets have been rallying, the fears of a slowdown have eased, and he's in this great position in which he can say that he's negotiating a fantastic trade deal, but nobody really knows what's in it, and we're just a few weeks away, and he's been a few weeks away for the last 2 months. And the reason maybe why this is extending for so long is because being a few weeks away from a fantastic trade deal is actually a great position for Trump to be in. And I think that will change, and the dynamic will change once the deal is actually done. We'll see what's in it, and the reactions start flooding in. It could be a big win for Trump, because he can say that he's fulfilled a key campaign promise, and there could be further rallies in the equity markets, and big cloud could be lifted, or it could go the other way. I mean, people could say this is an empty deal, it's mainly about purchases, the uncertainty is going to linger, and the markets could be disappointed by this. So I think that Trump is in a bit of a sweet spot at the moment, but that won't necessarily continue after the deal is done.
Let me pick up one other angle on the congressional reaction, because James, you talked about how it could be criticized for being not tough enough on China and not achieving the structural reforms that they set out to achieve. But now that we know these reforms will be bilateral obligations, so whether it's IP or some of the other areas, what is the risk that Congress will be concerned about the obligations that the U.S. is entering into as they apply to the United States, which, as you say, has a unilateral enforcement procedure? So just for example, IP provisions that might cause Democrats concern about how China might use them against the United States, or for Republicans, commitments related to currency manipulation and how China could use those against the United States. Is there a risk here that that could also be part of the congressional reaction?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. Well, I'm sure that I think particularly Democrats on the Hill, but probably also Republicans, will be combing through those, 150 pages of the deal and looking for any signs that the agreement creates obligations on the United States, which might even require a change in the law, and therefore that could open up a whole discussion about whether the deal needs to be approved by Congress. I think Ambassador Lighthizer is probably knows that and is being very careful about what is written in the deal to try to stave off any kind of a backlash of that nature. But clearly, when you're looking at such a broad agreement, I think once different constituencies see what the actual impact is on their interests, you will have some winners and you'll have some losers, and I think there will be probably some losers on the U.S. side who will worry about what the impact of this deal is, and it'll be fascinating to watch.
I would just add, I think Lighthizer is hypersensitive to U.S. sovereignty, and you've seen that in the course of the NAFTA negotiations. He fought to get this chapter taken out of the deal that would allow Canada and Mexico to challenge U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty decisions. And he's obviously taking a hard stance against the WTO, sort of this concept of global governance and having international agreements sort of corner the U.S. into certain policy decisions. So I think I think he would, especially with China, I think he would be very, very loath to see China have some new weapon they could use against us. And so I would, I guess I would probably be skeptical that any deal would give China any more power over the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, but the answer is, we don't really know because we haven't seen the text of this deal, and there haven't been, very broad consultations with industry. So, USTR and Ambassador Lighthizer are, obviously very, very smart, very well versed in China, but, are there potential side effects for American industry that they have not thought through? I mean, potentially, we will see that when the text of the deal is released. But I think James makes a really good point that, what happens after the text of the deal comes out. Because we don't know what's in the deal, this deal has managed to kind of be all things to everybody until the details of it are revealed. And it seems kind of logical that once we do know the text, there will be more opposition to it. There's the potential for congressional opposition. Figures like Chuck Schumer and Marco Rubio have both been very tough on the president on China, or some fears from the business community or Wall Street. So balancing all of those interests is obviously a very tall order from any kind of deal. And then the other point here is that in fact a lot of the structural reforms that we're talking about probably won't and indeed couldn't be accomplished in just one deal, right? So there will be a future of continued U.S.-China trade tensions and negotiations that we are definitely going to see after this deal is announced. And the big question is, does it set up this relationship for a more sort of strategic and cooperative partnership, or with this kind of enforcement mechanism where tariffs are still hanging over, does it just lead to the same kind of atmosphere or even more tension down the line?
Just one other comment. I would look at what Lou Dobbs says as much, or if not more, than what Marco Rubio or Chuck Schumer says. I mean, I think Trump responds far more to literally to Lou Dobbs and to others, other broadcasters, than he does to Congress. There are two examples you can point to. One in May or June, I forget exactly. No, May. They came back. The negotiators, mostly Mnuchin, thought he had the makings of the deal. The Chinese were talking about buying a lot of stuff, although the number at that point was $60 billion, which seemed like an awful lot of goods and services, and now it seems like chump change. But in any event, they thought that the Chinese and Mnuchin thought they got a deal. It was attacked by Lou Dobbs and others, and Trump backed off immediately. Deep sixed it. That's one example. Another example is Trump cut a deal with ZTE. Was roundly criticized on the Hill. I forget what Dobbs said at that point, but was roundly criticized by lots of people and held firm. So it's just hard to know how he responds to that sort of pressure.
If I could add a third example. On the Thursday night before the Friday Oval meeting with Liu He, Lou Dobbs criticized memoranda of understanding as being meaningless documents, nothing more than term sheets. So, a point well taken on the influence that some of the media will certainly have on how this agreement is received. Let's assume for a moment that they reach agreement. It's generally well received. Both sides decide to comply. Do we revert to the status quo ante? Is it sweetness and light, whether on the trade front, or are there other issues that will continue to complicate the relationship, whether inside or out of the realm of economics, that will continue to affect U.S.-China relations?
Okay, I'll just give it a start. So, on the one hand, you have Trump who will claim that it is the greatest deal that's ever been done, that nobody's ever come close to it, and so on and so forth. So, that would argue that things will calm down. On the other hand, the dogs have been unleashed. I mean, it's not just trade, right? I mean, we have national security fights, we have technology fights, we have the FBI looking into all sorts of espionage cases. So even if the trade part calmed down, we're in a different world.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think there's a lot more attention. I mean, I guess it's more public now. I think this fight with China has elevated it in the media, in the public eye, in terms of infiltration of China into the U.S. economy, into our research, our development. I think the government has been investigating that all along, but I think it's maybe more present now, with Huawei, with all these big stories, these big headlines, and I think that's going to continue to. There's going to be a continued focus, I think, on that going forward.
I mean, it seems that there had been some suggestion at some point, even by the president and Larry Kudlow, that issues such as Meng Wanzhou's extradition request could be folded into the trade talks at some point. So there could be some kind of a settlement of these kind of external issues on technology and Huawei and the sort of fears of China being a national security threat to the United States, and that could be somehow kind of some of the core issues there could be resolved or settled in some form as part of the deal. But I mean, I find that to be quite unlikely, particularly because it could, further sort of inflame the China hawks here. And I think that if there is going to be a deal with the Chinese, I presume that the tacit understanding is that there will be a deal on the trade and economic front, but the sort of confrontation will continue at sort of the Justice Department and the Commerce Department and Homeland Security, and that the U.S. isn't going to kind of take its eye off the ball on some of these other issues, because as Bob said, the kind of dogs have been unleashed, and it's going to be very hard to kind of correct the sort of narrative in Washington towards a relationship of greater engagement rather than confrontation.
I agree that the likelihood is probably for continued tension rather than the opposite. There are a lot of areas of potential tension in the relationship in the areas of national security, but one key area to focus on here is going to be the role of the business community. It's kind of a common observation that the business community for many decades was a kind of ballast in the U.S.-China relationship, a source of stability, putting pressure on the U.S. government not to take more punitive actions on China. And over the last few years, that has really kind of shifted with the business community, sort of giving their go-ahead to the administration to take this tougher approach. So, it's going to be really central here, whether or not some of the issues that the business community was concerned about are resolved. And that gets to the question of structural reform. And even when China is, proposing legal changes, for example, to its foreign investment law, I think there's still a lot of skepticism over whether all of the barriers to foreign business operating in China are going to be removed. People often talk about kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts, how even if the law is changed, there are other regulatory barriers or other strategies that China takes that discriminate against foreign business. So it seems like few people I'm talking to think that this issue is going to be wholly resolved, and so there is a lot more potential for tension in those areas, I think, even if we do strike a deal.
Great. Let me turn to the audience for questions from you. This is your chance to question the questioners, so take advantage.
Mike, we'll have a mic runner come around and ask people to please identify who you're with, your name and affiliation, and to keep your questions short. I'm just going to make one interesting observation, James. We learned something, maybe indirectly, from one of your comments, that you were saying that the deal is always 2 months away. And I'm reminded about, in Bob Caro's book, Master of the Senate. Now I'm thinking maybe Trump read it, because in that book it says that the promise of a future benefit or punishment is much more valuable than actual delivery. You maintain your leverage. So I hadn't thought about maybe that Trump had read that book, but maybe he has.
Likely.